This segment is sponsored by U.S. Gold, whose market cap is nearly $1 billion. And our friend Rob McEwen, former CEO of Gold Corp, owns a 22% stake. U.S. Gold discovered a large 5 million ounce silver deposit in Mexico and has an aggressive exploration program with 15 drills turning while their Nevada project is moving towards production with a pre-feasibility to be completed by the third quarter of this year. U.S. Gold is the only gold exploration company listed on the New York Stock Exchange, and the symbol is UXG. This is King World News. I'm Eric King, and you're about to hear from the man who brought down the $65 billion Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme and who now accuses two major banks of stealing $6 to $10 billion from tens of millions of Americans' pension funds. His name is Harry Markopolos. Remember to go to our homepage at kingworldnews.com for more interviews where we have an outstanding segment with the incredibly popular Ben Davies, and where earlier in the week we had Rick Rule, Peter Schiff, and Martin Armstrong. And with gold and silver on the move, don't miss the KWN Weekly Metals Wrap. Joining us now is Harry Markopolos, the man who broke open the $65 billion Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme. Harry, what is happening with Bank of New York Mellon for the listeners globally?
Well, Bank of New York's going to go down, Eric. The New York Attorney General filed suit on Tuesday accusing the bank of stealing foreign currency from pension funds from tens of millions of Americans, policemen, firemen, librarians, municipal workers, judges, state legislatures, and the list goes on. And they've been doing it for decades. And it's been a hell of a crime spree for the bank, but now they're being brought to justice.
How do you see this playing out? Because they just took out full-page ads today to say they were innocent.
The bank took out full-page ads in today's Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Financial Times, which shows how desperate they are. They're saying the charges are baseless and they're going to defend them vigorously. Well, talk is cheap. If they're going to defend them, there's only one place to defend those cases, and that's before a jury. They need to get into the jury box. They refuse to set trial dates. The government's ready for trial tomorrow. Why won't the bank agree to trial dates if they're so innocent? And the answer is they're not so innocent.
This was a 10-year fraud, it looks like, Harry, and essentially what they were doing is using the foreign currency markets to steal the money.
Every day, every time a state pension fund traded, the bank would steal approximately 0.3% from every transaction. Every time a pension fund bought a currency, the bank would mark a high price for the day. They would look back, because currency trades on a 24-hour clock. What the Bank of New York would do is look back 20 hours and assign all the state pension funds' purchase transactions at the high of the day. And every time a state pension fund tried to sell a currency, they would assign them a price at the lows of the day. And they would pocket the difference. And they did that not for just 10 years, but for decades. Every day for decades.
And Harry, Bank of New York Mellon is one of the largest custodians in the world. They have $25 trillion of assets under custody. Is that why you think that they put those full-page ads in there? They're having some bleed off of clients who are saying we better get the heck out of Bank of New York Mellon.
I'm certain that the clients are concerned and calling, and if they read the complaints by the Florida Attorney General, by the Virginia Attorney General, by the New York Attorney General, and by the United States Attorney for the Southern District of Manhattan. And if they read the emails in those complaints and look at the math and look at how much was stolen, they would realize that they, too, are victims. And so they would have cause for concern to pull their accounts from the Bank of New York. These one-page ads show how desperate the bank truly is.
Harry, is this the kind of thing where the Department of Justice may become involved eventually?
Well, they already are. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, based in Manhattan, Mr. Preet Bharara, has filed suit under FERIA. Basically, he's defending other banks that Bank of New York ripped off. So he's defending federally insured financial institutions, and he's accusing the Bank of New York stealing hundreds of millions of dollars from these banks. And so he stepped in, and he has an injunction order in demanding that the bank stop their theft immediately. He's also charging the bank with mail fraud and wire fraud, but he's doing so civilly, because if he charged the bank criminally, the bank would go bankrupt within a week, because customers' deposits would flow out of a bank. No bank has ever survived criminal charges, and this bank wouldn't either, so he only charged them civilly. That keeps the Bank of New York in business, but they're skating on very, very thin ice.
Well, how do you see this playing out for Bank of New York Mellon? Are they going to be in trouble financially over this anyway with the suits that are coming against them?
Well, they are. The board of directors has to realize that management at the top level, in the C-level suite, the CEO, the CFO, and the general counsel, cannot be trusted. They have to read those complaints and do the math. And if they do the math, the board would discover that approximately 20% of Bank of New York's net income, bottom line, comes from foreign exchange fraud. And at that point, their external auditors would have to realize that that clean audit opinion they gave the bank needs to be withdrawn because the bank has serious issues under Sarbanes-Oxley that potentially would send the CEO and CFO to prison for 20 years for willful misstatement of financials.
Harry, this opens up the door, obviously, for investor and shareholder lawsuits as well.
I would expect that the shareholders will be filing class action suits once they realize the extent of the fraud. It was ongoing. And let me be clear, the government can only go back 10 years, and so that's what they filed their case for. But this case spanned decades. This bank didn't learn to steal just 10 years ago. They've been doing it for many decades. And so the victim state pension funds lost access to the money years ago that they could have reinvested. And so they've lost the opportunity cost to reinvest that money because they never had it. It was stolen from them many decades ago. And so the losses are actually higher than what the lawsuits are claiming. Unfortunately, there's a statute of limitations that limits the government to only going back 10 years.
Harry, when you look at the full-page ads that were run today, those are sort of spitting in the eye of the prosecutors. What do you make of that strategy?
The bank has a very aggressive strategy, basically threatening the New York Attorney General, saying, do you know who we are? Do you know how many thousands of employees we have in New York? And they're also accusing the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of Manhattan. They're accusing him of doing a copycat complaint that was not well researched. And so they're insulting the man's intelligence. It's not smart to insult the prosecution. It's not going to win you any favors in the courtroom. And if you try to settle, the price just went up because these people have reputations, they have feelings, and you can't call them stupid and you can't threaten the prosecutors. It's not a wise move on the bank's part. It shows desperation.
Harry, this is another massive fraud, and you've uncovered this, you and your team. It wasn't these other people. They've just jumped in alongside with you.
Yes. Well, we did the original groundbreaking research. This case, I started it in September 2003. It took me a few years to figure it out and connect the dots of information. But in 2007, I started recruiting a team of brave whistleblowers, and to their credit, they were in the inside of the industry. They knew what was wrong, and they knew what was right, and they knew they had to do something. And all I did was show them the way and encourage them to do the right thing, which they all did. And then we hired the right lawyers, and we started filing these cases in April 2008, and we continued filing them through 2009. It took a lot of work by many people across the country, brave men and women working diligently. And, of course, we had our partners in the government, in law enforcement. I'd have to thank the Attorney General for Florida. She's been magnificent. Pam Biondi, phenomenal. I'd have to say that Ken Cuccinelli, the Attorney General in Virginia, a great job on his staff's part. And certainly in New York, I'd like to thank Randy Fox, the Bureau Chief for the Taxpayer Protection Bureau, Greg Krakauer, Eric Schneiderman, Attorney General there, has done a phenomenal job, and Preet Bharara, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York and Manhattan, a fine job by his staff. But more needs to be done. There's 47 more states that have yet to be heard from. This is a 50-state case that's affected tens of millions of Americans' retirement savings. So many of your listeners here that are hearing this today are victims, and they should be damn angry.
Let me ask you, Harry, when you see, this is alleged at this point. It's an alleged theft. By the looks of the complaint, I've read it. Obviously, you're heavily involved. This looks bad for the Bank of New York Mellon. I don't see how they're going to wiggle their way out of this. But assuming just for a moment that they're guilty of this, when you see this kind of theft, outright theft, Harry, by the banks, what do you think when you see this?
If Al-Qaeda had done this to Americans, SEAL Team 6 will be dropping in. But the banks did that. And so maybe law enforcement needs to drop into those corporate boardrooms and treat them like SEAL Team 6 treated Osama bin Laden. These bankers think they're above the law. They're arrogant. They're saying they're going to defend. They say they're innocent, yet they refuse to set trial dates. And they're stealing from tens of millions of Americans. And by the way, Bank of New York Mellon's a TARP bank, so we bailed them out so they could pay bonuses by stealing our pension money. I say that's wrong on every level, and Americans have to be angry at this point. The banks got away with the biggest crime spree ever in 2008, the largest bank heist in history, and everybody got away with the money. No one went to jail. Who's picking up the tab? We are, the taxpayer, and our children, and probably our grandchildren will end up paying for this debacle. It's not fair.
Harry, when you talk about this, obviously Bernie Madoff is in prison. You helped put him there. But what about these bankers that have done this? I hear anger in your voice that they're not in prison or not being brought to justice in the criminal system.
Well, let's take a look at Merrill Lynch. Stan O'Neill was the chairman and CEO. He said he was a genius. His board said he was a genius. They paid him total compensation, including bonuses and severance package, of $361 million. all he did was take Merrill into near bankruptcy, so it had to get rescued by Bank of America, which the taxpayers had to rescue. So how is that fair for the American taxpayer? We say it's a meritocracy, and yet the profits are for capitalists, and when there's losses, it's for the taxpayers. There's socialism when there's losses. How fair is that? It's not fair to you or I, because when we struggle in business, we don't get bailed out. But if it's a big corporation, they get bailed out, and yet they get to keep the upside, all the profits. Well, how fair is that? Mom and pop in America, they don't get bailed out. Only the big guys do. So you have to ask, who controls our government? Who does the government answer to? And you'd have to say both political parties are corrupt and answer to corporate interests only, and they don't represent taxpayers' interests at all.
Part of the arrogance on Bank of New York Mellon's part, as you mentioned, Harry, is that criminal charges are not being brought because they don't want to give the appearance they're trying to take down the bank. But if you just keep spitting in the eye of the prosecutors, do they risk criminal charges being brought against them? Or is that why they're so arrogant? They know that's just not going to happen.
I think the banks feel they're above the law, that they're too big to fail, too big to punish, and obviously too big to manage correctly. And having any institution feel it's above the law sets moral hazard into play. And so I think the prosecutors have to pick a bank at some point in the future and say, we are going to kill this bank to send a message to all bankers out there that they better toe the line and follow the law or else. I don't think we're at that point yet. Obviously, I'm not calling for that in this case. But at some point, the prosecutors are going to have to wake out and pick out one of these institutions and charge it criminally to restore law and order, because right now the banks feel they have a get-out-of-jail-free card, and no one should have that. No one is above the law.
Harry, when you've watched this criminal activity in the banking system, you and your team, does it stop here, or do you continue on with these against other banks and institutions?
I'm glad you asked that. State Street Bank is just as guilty. In fact, they're more guilty. And the reason they're more guilty is they steal about the same $500 million a year that Bank of New York Mellon does, but it's a bigger portion of State Street's net income. And so the fraud is about a full third of State Street's bottom line net income. And the shareholders are going to get punished for that. When they finally wake up and they do the math and they realize how much the bank has stolen, at that point, the bank's in trouble. And State Street's CEO, CFO, general counsel, chief risk officer, everybody, the bank needs to clean house. The board needs to take control, hire an outside law firm to hire forensic accountants, and get to the bottom of this. And Ernst & Young, their external auditor, needs to do a close examination of the books and records of the bank, because they'll find that it's about a third of their net income comes from foreign exchange fraud.
Harry, alongside this, I know California is now coming in against State Street Bank. They're charging them. Can you talk about that for the listeners?
Certainly. Then Attorney General, now currently Governor of California, Jerry Brown, filed the initial lawsuit and unsealed it on October 20th, 2009, against State Street, demanding $200 million for his state's pension funds that were victims of this fraud. He has damning emails in his complaint. This case, we're ready for trial. We cannot get State Street to agree to a trial date. State Street has been slow in producing documents. They're refusing to go to trial, yet they say they're innocent. It's the same situation as the Bank of New York Mellon. These banks have been caught red-handed, and they're telling the big lie. Everybody at those banks is drinking the Kool-Aid, assuming the same posture. Well, they're not innocent, and the only way they can prove innocence or guilt is before a jury. They need to face juries as soon as possible, because California is ready for trial today.
Harry, let me ask you this in closing. Is this industry-wide, in your opinion, what's taking place here?
My whistleblowers tell me this is an industry-wide practice, that all the custody banks do it. They've been doing it for decades. So basically, anybody who has a retirement account that's invested in international assets, whether it be bonds or stocks, has been a victim of this scheme, and they need to get their money back. Many mutual funds, very large mutual fund organizations, are victims of this. So if you invest in mutual funds and they're international funds, and the banks are custodying these assets and trading under standing instruction trades, they're a victim. And so I would say that this case affects tens of millions of Americans' retirement savings, and it's wrong. And that's what's paying these bankers bonuses, and that's wrong. And justice needs to be served. It can only be served before a jury of 12, and that's where we're headed.
One final thing, Harry, very quickly here. This is necessary to clean up the country of this type of criminal and fraudulent activity for us to go forward and have any type of chance to make this as a nation, don't you think?
Oh, I agree. I am very upset, like most Americans, at what's taking place. It's clear that the bank's executives, their strategy is, we have to lie to maintain the fraud. We can't admit to our board how much we stole and how large a portion of the net income it really is. If we do, our shareholders will punish our share price. And, of course, we'll be fired. And our punishment will be to take our golden parachutes and our bonuses and retire. Well, that's not fair. It's easy to stroke a check to make this fraud to settle these cases with the government. It's easy to pay away the shareholders' money and skate off into a rich and lucrative retirement. But how fair is that, I ask you? It's not fair at all for the shareholders because they're the ultimate victims. It's going to impact the payment of dividends to them. It's going to impact the share price. It's wrong on every level, and yet the shareholders sit there and they vote for the current board of directors who are no better than potted houseplants and rubber stamps. The board needs to take control of these companies and make things right.
In closing, Harry, what other ways are the banks stealing from people?
Every American who travels overseas is a victim of foreign currency fraud, for the most part. There's a bank cartel out there, and they charge 3% foreign exchange transaction fees. They're charging you basically 100 times more than what it costs them to trade foreign exchange. So they're stealing from you every day in every way. But finally, I think thanks to these cases that we have against Bank of New York and State Street, you're seeing two firms break away from the pack and break away from cartel pricing. And that, I'd like to congratulate them. Capital One offers 0 foreign transaction fees. So they're treating you honestly. The other credit card company that's treating you honestly is American Express. For the Platinum and Black card holders, there are no foreign currency fees. And so if you're going to travel overseas, my advice to you is to grab one of those two credit cards because the rest of the credit card companies, MasterCard and Visa, are out there to steal from you. And you don't want to allow yourself to be an easy victim. So just switch credit cards if you're going to go overseas. That's my advice to your listeners, Eric.
Harry Markopolos, the man who broke open the $65 billion Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme, now has a multi-billion-dollar bank scheme happening here he's uncovered. Who knows, Harry? You may be a modern-day Elliot Ness and your team, the new Untouchables. Thank you for joining us on King World News.
Thank you for having me, Eric.
KWN has a special Sunday release with Jim Rickards because of all of the tremendous volatility in the global markets. We will have blogs over the weekend as well, and be sure to tune in as we will continue to release interviews with the top people in the world throughout the week. Also, check out the King World News blog where this past couple of weeks we had Chris Whalen, Martin Armstrong, Felix Zuloff, Andrew McGuire, Peter Schiff, Ben Davies, Robin Griffiths, James Turk, Michael Pinto, Richard Russell, Mark Faber, Pierre Lassonde, Gerald Salente, John Embry, Jim St. Clair, John Hathaway, and James Dines.